The proceeding is currently in private. 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 The proceeding is currently in private.
Order, order. Thank you very much to the four of you for coming to give evidence this morning. We do appreciate you sparing the time and making the effort to come here. We've tried to put some distance between you this morning as much as been possible, but we do appreciate you coming into Parliament and not working from home and being here with us this morning to answer, I think, some really important questions on behalf of the people who you represent about what support is needed. And of course we're expecting now some sort of package from the Chancellor later today, which I'm sure that many of your members will very much welcome and will look forward to seeing. And we're keen to explore this morning what sorts of things that should include and what support your members, the people who you represent, are looking for. So can I just start by asking, perhaps first you, Paul Nowak, the measures announced in last week's budget, the Chancellor, of course, said at the time that he would come back if more was necessary, and the government now acknowledged that as things have progressed, more will be necessary. On the issue, particularly around statutory sick pay, has enough happened so far? And if not, what more is needed?
Yeah, no, not enough has happened, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to say a few words. Just on statutory sick pay, I think it's important to acknowledge the government did make some positive steps forward, so moving to paying SSP from day one rather than after 3 days, and obviously providing the rebate for smaller businesses. But we said at the time actually that more was needed. It's a fact that there are still 1.9 million people who don't earn enough to meet the thresholds for statutory sick pay, £118 a week. Where it is paid, It's not paid at a sufficient level, just £94.25 a week. We polled 2,000 of our members, nearly 50% of them said that would mean that they couldn't pay their basic bills, their 48%, their basic bills, their rent, their mortgage, their basic household costs. So we've been asking the Chancellor to urgently address that. And actually, even in the government's own consultation on SSP last year, it talked about the need, for example, to remove the lower earnings threshold. And I think practically as we move forward, and there's lots more that I want to say about other measures the government needs to take, but they'll have to look to put that rebate in place for all employers, not just small employers. This is something where employers and unions and governments are going to have to work together. We can start with SSP, but that alone won't be enough.
When you say rebate needed for all employers, what would you be looking for there in terms of the rebate?
Well, I think a similar sort of package of support that's being offered to smaller employers now. But I think there's lots more that needs to be done. I mean, not to go too far off the territory of SSP, but if you look at the announcement yesterday, and for example, the advice for people not to visit pubs and restaurants, but not to mandate pubs and restaurants and other businesses to close down, that is having a real and immediate and pressing impact on employers now.
We'll definitely come on to that.
Okay.
Could I ask you, Alistair, in terms of statutory sick pay and the people you represent, the self-employed, what are you looking for in terms of further measures on statutory sick pay?
So I think when the budget came out, we kind of gave it a sort of cautious welcome. We recognised the government was trying to do two things. One, make it quicker and easier for self-employed people to access the welfare benefit system. And secondly, there was that package of business support measures. I think as time has kind of gone on, and as we've thought about it, and as we've got feedback from our members and the self-employed freelancers in particular sectors more generally, I think although the statutory sick pay question is an important one, and extending that to the self-employed would be helpful, I think we've really realised the key issue here is this is not just a health crisis, it is going to become an income crisis for millions of people. And really, if you get this virus, or if you're advised to self-isolate, it's one question as to how you can then access funds to cover the sort of 2 weeks that you'll have to recover. If you're facing no income for the next 3, potentially 4 months as a result of projects being cancelled, events not happening, and you have rent to pay, food costs, childcare, all the rest of it, I think we need to be moving very quickly to something which IPSE are beginning to push, which is more of a temporary income protection fund, so that people can basically keep their businesses alive and at the same time cover basic living costs. And we might want to come on to this in a bit more detail, but Norway yesterday announced a measure kind of along those lines, which we might want to talk a bit more about later.
So Norway yesterday announced full pay for those laid off for 20 days. Self-employed were to get 80% of their average income over the last 3 years, with a ceiling of 600 Norwegian kroner. In Sweden, I think it's 90% of income guaranteed, paid half by the government and half by the employer. And in Denmark, 75% of salaries would be paid, again with a cap of how much you can get a month. Are those the sorts of measures
I think
that you're looking for?
Those seem very sensible. If you just look at the raw numbers, I know that there's, because Universal Credit and ESA, there's means tested elements in there. But broadly speaking, you've got sick pay at around £95 a week, UC just under £80, and ESA sort of 74, 75. We have to be pretty clear here that this is not going to compensate for what people would typically be earning, and it's just going to mean that there's a big shortfall between what's coming in and what are their outgoing expenditures.
And this sort of measure, obviously, from your perspective, you would like to see go beyond statutory sick pay, so it would be people who there's no work available, particularly your members who are self-employed, but also others who may be full-time employed on an employment contract, but there might not be the work available because there's no custom. So it would be beyond statutory sick pay. It'd be people who are made redundant, or people who there's no work available currently. Is that right, Alistair?
I think so. In terms of IPSE, what we're saying, we're kind of really just trying to flag the kind of self-employed aspect of this. So that's kind of where we would, where we're drawing.
And can I ask you, Ray Newton-Smith, from CBI's perspective, is that the sort of thing that you're calling for, or is it not quite as broad?
So a few things. I think, first of all, we're trying to provide as much advice to all businesses as possible, and in line with some of the government advice through our website. I think that's really important. I think absolutely businesses' priority is around people at the moment. I do think we need to come on to the wider economic issues that are unfolding as well. But if I just focus on sick pay at the moment, I think there's quite a few areas where I think we need more clarity and more support from government. So for, just taking some examples, so on the sick pay, you no longer need a sick note to be eligible, and they said use 111. But now the advice, of course, is not to call 111 when you are sick. So there are just some simple clarity measures that we need better and more consistent information from government. And I think, importantly, there's also been questions about, picking up on what Alistair was saying around, first of all, sick pay should apply to all workers, so not just the employed, it needs to apply for workers as well. And then we need to look at what happens to those who are under £118 a week. And there were some measures in the budget around upping universal credit for those people. But there's still a lot of questions as to how that will work in practice. And those are the sorts of questions employers are getting. And I think we just need more clarity. And I think we also need to think about, further down the line, if the amount of sick pay for small businesses and even up to large businesses, if it becomes too large, I think the government will need to step in to cover some of that sick pay. I don't think we can only expect employers to cover all of that cost, particularly if they're in an industry where they've had to shut their doors. And businesses want to protect as many jobs as possible. But you can see, this could very easily get critical. And I think the other issue that is definitely on businesses' minds and will be upon us very soon is what we do for carers as well. And if schools close, and I think we do need to very quickly look at how we extend sick pay also to carers, and then how we divide the costs of that between business and government. That's such a critical issue that needs to be addressed now.
Thank you very much, Rain. Just picking up on some of those issues. For many of your members, and actually for many workers, Paul, statutory sick pay is not the issue, because many people will be getting more than that for extended periods of time. Probably half of workers or half of employees will get more than statutory sick pay. But obviously that's something that the firm at the moment is paying themselves. Is that the point you're making, Rain, that for many businesses, perhaps particularly bigger businesses that have got more generous schemes for people who are off sick, those costs potentially could overwhelm some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as this evolves, that's a challenge. Businesses are absolutely where they can, saying they will cover they will cover the wages of their employees, whether they have to take time off to look after dependents, whether they are self-isolating, or whether they're covering sick pay in line with their company policy. But you can imagine for some businesses this is going to be a promise they're going to find it very hard to deliver on further down the track. If you take the pubs, that have had to close their doors, and if you think more broadly around the airline industry at the moment, it is fighting for survival, and that is not just about the airline carriers, it's the airports, it's all the pubs and restaurants that are in those industries. That's a huge number of jobs, and that issue is far beyond sick pay. It's about just cash is going out the door. They're trying to pay their employees, and there's no revenue coming in. We're
very keen to pick on some of the particular industries a bit later on. Just bring Paul Nowak in on the issue of
just to pick up that point, because it is beyond statutory sick pay and contractual sick pay. It doesn't matter whether it's the hospitality industry, aviation, manufacturing. We are now seeing employers talking to staff about potential layoffs and redundancies. And what we need to do is not just to mitigate the impact of those redundancies, we need to avoid them in the first place. And precisely what those packages in Sweden, in Germany, in Norway, Denmark, Austria are designed to do is to allow employers to hold on to staff, which is important obviously for the well-being of staff in the here and now and for companies and their relationship with staff, but will also be crucial for the recovery when it does come, because what we don't need to see is companies having to restaff up, skills that might have been lost to the organisation. So these short-term wage subsidies, if there was a message to the Chancellor today for short-time working, if there was a message to the Chancellor today in terms of that package, putting in place a comprehensive package of support for short-time working is absolutely vital.
Yeah. Again, I'm keen to talk a bit more about keeping workers attached to firms, but perhaps a little bit later on. At this point, I'll bring in Paul Howe.
Thank you, Chair. I think you've been very comprehensive in what you've covered there so far, but just one dimension, just to clarify what I thought I heard, and that's that we've always talked about the statutory sick pay level and whether people can actually survive on that level as to where it is. But the way that discussion went there, just in picking it up, if you look at it from the firm's perspective, and particularly the firms that actually have good sick pay schemes in place that are paying people close to what they normally get and all of that sort of thing, then it becomes almost irrelevant whether the government fixes it up or whatever for the employee perspective, because there's just such a huge amount of money that's going to go out from employees and from employers and or the business to solve this. Whichever way you look at it, the government's going to have to get behind something somewhere. It's not just about the micro level. I mean, there's been other discussions on the support side, I think, which I'd be interested in your view on, as to whether we need to do something about increasing the payments of SSP and things to people, or whether you actually mitigate it by hitting the rents that people pay and the utility bills that they have to pay and stopping the payments out to therefore mean that the SSP amount is more appropriate. I don't know.
I guess I would just say, at the moment, in terms of what we're seeing across businesses and across sectors, I think their concern for their staff is around sick pay. And there's lots of questions that emerged kind of very early when this crisis hit us. And what they don't want their staff to worry, so they want some of these issues resolved. But actually, in terms of where are firms having the biggest impact and what will ultimately cause some firms to have to, what we want to do is to save as many jobs as possible and to save as many viable businesses as possible so that we have a healthy economy once we come through this crisis. And on that, I think that the challenges that businesses are facing are the size is much bigger than just the amount they would have to pay out in sick pay, though they are looking down the track and worried about what might hit them further down the line. But I think, I know we'll come on to the sectoral discussion, but I think, to my mind, the action we need to see the Chancellor taking today is to provide loans. Think about larger businesses. Think about what you can do immediately through the tax system to provide some of the relief, so that cash flow doesn't become the issue that causes some firms to go to the wall and go under now and mean that we end up with lots of more people being unemployed than if we took early action now.
Paul Nowak.
Sorry, just quickly, Chair, just one point to follow up, and again it goes beyond the sick pay issue. Rain mentioned about support for carers. Our schools haven't closed yet, but we know at some stage the schools will close, and we do need to think again about a package of support that's going to mean that parents can look after their kids without being out of pocket. We've made clear to government we think that people should be paid at their normal contractual rate for that, and again that businesses should be able to claim the overwhelming proportion of that cost back from the government. There is no nil-cost solution to these fundamental problems that we're all going to face over the next few months, and it is important that families can feel assured that they can follow the public health advice, can support their families, and also have a decent income at the end of all of this.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Pat McFadden.
Thank you. I think it's fair to say, and even to be fair to the government, we are all trying to cope with a situation which is completely unprecedented in terms of its impact on human behaviour. And that's why this is different from previous financial crises and so on. And I just want to explore this issue of income for people in that light. traditional government packages of support tend to revolve around guaranteeing credit from banks, tax reliefs and so on. Could I begin perhaps with you, Rain Newton-Smith? I know it's very early days, but has the CBI got an estimate of the number of people that will be laid off as a result of the announcements from the government yesterday about pubs, restaurants, entertainment venues and so on? I mean, Hospitality UK are quoted this morning as talking about hundreds of thousands of redundancies. Do you think that's fair? Do you have a different number?
I don't think I can give you a number of jobs at this stage, because the other thing is it does depend on what action is taken now, and I guess where our priority is let's get the policies in place so that we don't end up in that situation. But is this a critical situation for a lot of businesses? Absolutely. And the pubs, cafes and restaurants and theatres closing is obviously critical for those businesses, but also you've got the airline industry where flights are grounded now, right? And for the foreseeable future. So we need, and that's why we need swift action now to try and protect as many jobs as possible. And I think I should say, the action last week from the Treasury and the Bank of England, that was very welcome. I think the coordinated action was really helpful. But I think we need to be at the stage where the government is saying we will do whatever it takes to support the airline industry through what is a temporary issue. And I think the same is there for hotels and retail. In retail, of course, it's a bit more mixed because people are out there buying things online. They're out there buying household goods. So I think the policy reaction in that sector is a bit different. But there's no doubt that this is absolutely critical to the survival of firms and hundreds of thousands of jobs, potentially, if we fail to act now.
Mr McTague, could I bring you in on what whatever it takes might mean? We've been looking a little bit about what other countries have announced in the last, some of this is just in the last day or two, so it is very quick. But for example, Denmark has said they will pay 75% of employees' salaries until June, up to a maximum of around €3,500 per month. France proposed last night a £300 billion package which requires businesses to pay 70% of the cost of pay, with the government rebating the businesses a proportion of that. Do you think that we need direct government subsidy of pay for those employees who are laid off as a result of the measures announced yesterday?
I think the short answer is yes. I think we've reached that point. You mentioned in your opening remarks about behavioural changes. Yeah. One area, though, that worries me seriously is the self-employed, the plumbers, the carpenters, the electricians and so on. A lot of those people are now saying, well, look, I'm going to prioritise my income over my health because I am more frightened about the long-term damage to my income. And I think the only people that can step in at this stage and try and reassure them is the government. And I think in one sense, the government's going to have to take the role of a sort of benign employer, providing the kind of safety net that means that people don't behave in a panicky way, don't start taking short-term decisions that could damage us all in the long run.
I think, just to add on that point as well, so to go kind of back to the budget in terms of the self-employed, we have a lot of concern that fundamentally there is huge risk in a kind of handing off large numbers of self-employed people to the welfare system if they have not traditionally used it. We've done, we've provided evidence to committees in the past about the kind of complexities of universal credit, and I know that the government's made tweaks in terms of the minimum income floor and bits like that, but we just think that as a system is probably not prepared for the number of people that will come in, and also those people themselves will really struggle to navigate that. And similarly, on the business support side, I can't comment too much on some of the budget measures which were around the business interruption loan scheme that the government announced. But having had a quick look through of it, my fear and my impression is that that kind of approach in terms of loans for the future, or even some of the actions that the Bank of England have taken, those things are just not tailored to how self-employed people run their businesses and their lives, because their businesses and their personal finances are completely intertwined. And I think you are, as Martin was saying there, you're needing something that looks more like an income replacement rather than possibly giving them some kind of loan or big insurance that they are then kind of going to be paying back over a period of months, potentially years further down the line.
Can I just back down Rob there? Sorry, I was just going to say that we're seeing a really poor response at ground level from the banks with this introduction. It's as if, at chief executive level, there is a very clear understanding and a lot of right things have been said, but when it comes to the sharp end, a lot of the relationship managers that deal with our kind of firms just are completely adrift. And a lot of it is very bureaucratic. It seems to be modelled on the enterprise finance guarantee, so that most of them are trying to think about, well, would this business be viable under normal circumstances? Well, that just simply does not cut it in this circumstance.
I think it's a very good point.
And we will definitely come on to that in a bit more detail in due course. Rain, do you want to come in?
I think one of the principles around your question that I think we really need to do is to use existing mechanisms, because that will get money to those who need it as quickly as possible. I think the government may want to consider some form of employment allowance, but what I would encourage them to do is to use existing schemes. So you could use the employer's contributions into NICs, into national insurance contributions, to provide some relief. You could even think about extending that further. And you could also, if you provided temporary, say you will waive, businesses don't have to pay business rates for 3 months or 6 months, so that they can then support the employment. That's a very direct way of getting cash into businesses. You'd need to make sure that central government paid that shortfall into local authorities, because we don't want to put more pressure on local authorities. But in some sense, the central government can borrow to support that cash flow to businesses. And that's probably one of the most effective ways to support as many jobs as possible, as quickly as possible. Because I think, to build on Alistair's point, and I know we'll come on to this, I think some of the problems with the 5 billion emergency funds, they talked about the 1 billion that will be available to smaller businesses through the British Business Bank, is the administration to try and access that cash just seems to take too long, and I think it will be too slow and too bureaucratic to really help the businesses who need relief now, so we can protect as many jobs as possible.
Tax holidays have been part of the packages announced in various countries. For example, I believe Spain has offered a 6-month tax holiday for self-employed and small businesses and so on. So some countries are doing that. But just before I finish, I'd like to bring in Paul Nowak on this question of direct wage income subsidies, however you want to term this. Do you believe, Paul, that given the specific nature of this crisis, allied to the government advice to the public announced yesterday, that rather than just relying on the traditional benefit routes, as it were, many of these people won't be sick, they'll just have been told you can't come to work because there's no work for you, that the government has to give some sort of income subsidy to those who are laid off as a result?
Yeah, absolutely, Pat. I think this is a fundamentally different situation. As I say, I spoke to employees in the hospitality sector yesterday. I spoke to one of our unions today about the aviation supply chain, and you can roll these conversations right out across transport, across manufacturing, well, there's two things. I think one is we do need that comprehensive short-time working support. I think what's interesting about the packages of support that the committee have talked about in different countries is that they have been designed not just by government alone, but employers, unions and governments sitting together and deciding what is best to support employers and employees alike. And this is another point that I would make, which is actually not about cash, but it is about approach. I would like to see the government take a consistent approach across sectors, think about how we do design packages of support. So yesterday, DFT coordinated a telephone conference with unions in the transport sector to try and get intelligence about what was happening across the sector, what might be some of the things that would be important in terms of making sure we can still deliver to supermarkets and so on. I'd like to see us have those discussions across every sector. And one of the things the TUC has called for is a national task force bringing together employers, unions and government precisely to gather this sort of intelligence, to answer the question you asked before. How many people are going to be affected? Honest answer, nobody quite knows, partly because we don't know what mitigating actions might be taken by government, but partly because nobody has collated the impact in hospitality, manufacturing and transport. But also to think about where the next pressure points are coming down the line. If our schools do close, for example, who are the key workers that we need to make sure that they've got childcare so that they can go to work, not just those working in the NHS and in our public services and emergency services, but people, for example, working in transport. And as I say, to make sure we get these packages of support right so they work for employers, dealing with practical issues, short-term cash flow problems and all the rest of it, but work for our members as well. So this is where I would encourage government to take that sort of, nobody has got the answers to all of these problems and questions because nobody's faced this situation before. But I think what we can learn successfully from other countries is that getting key stakeholders in a room together to design measures, make sure that those measures actually deliver what you want them to.
It's very reassuring to hear all four of you singing very much from the same hymn sheet about what you want to see for all the people you represent, and it seems to me that there is a very close alignment between what businesses want and what workers want and need as well, and that's very reassuring and encouraging to see this morning. Can I bring in Alan Brown?
Thanks, Chair. Just very similar to what Pat was talking about. I got contacted by a constituent yesterday. He's called Regan Moran. He's an employee representative for 400 Coca-Cola field sales representatives. And he had an alarming phone call. Coca-Cola talking about, we don't really need you just now. We're going to widespread layoffs. Now, he made the point, if he goes straight on universal credit, he's got a salary above average wage, he's on universal credit, can't match his outgoings. So I think that touches on the need that was agreed about direct support. Is there anything else the UK government should be doing to actually try and reassure multinational companies not to take rash, short-term decisions, presumably because they think they can maybe re-employ people once things pick back up? But that's no way to treat your employees, and obviously it's going to cause further damage to the economy in terms of them not having spending power. So what can the UK government do about that? And then if we're talking about working together collaboratively, how do you target the people whose jobs we're going to protect and who gets support? Because that's going to become a big issue as well. Every job's important to them, but other people are going to scream about priorities. So how do you bring all that into the mix? And I've fired quite a lot there, so I don't know who wants to take that up.
Maybe I'll take some of that. I don't want to comment on individual businesses. I think what I can say from the businesses I've been speaking to is they are doing all they can to protect jobs, to support their workers, and also to help the country in crisis. So to provide the critical services we need, whether that's what the supermarkets are doing to make sure that everyone has what they need, whether you're self-isolating or not. I think there's a lot of effort going into that, or whether it's what manufacturers are doing and the work they've been doing with the government around, is there anything they can do in terms of repurposing their production line to produce more ventilators? And there's so many more of those problems that are going to come down the track where businesses are willing to step in and help, whether that's trying to figure out who are the vulnerable households, how do we identify them, how do we help local authorities identify them, and how do we get to them? And that's IT companies working with local authorities to the distributors, and I think business absolutely stands ready to help. I think the other thing to really bear in mind is that we will get through this, and I think you're right, what we want to do is to support as many jobs through the next 3 months, because we can look to the experience of other countries. We know in China they are opening up the factories, people are returning to work. It's been relatively short and intense in China, and I think we just have to hope that we can keep this as short as possible, and that therefore we can get the economy back up and running. I probably there's probably not much more I can say in terms of supporting vulnerable households. It's probably for some of the others to reflect on. But I think, from the measures that were set out in the budget, there were some helpful measures for local authorities to try and support vulnerable households. There were obviously the action around universal credit, but it's certainly something I'd want the government to watch, whether there are vulnerable households that will need further protection.
Yeah. Fundamentally, Alan, I think it does go back to that support for short-term working subsidies, but I think it also reinforces the point I made before about having an awareness of what's happening at a sectoral level. And one thing I'd say about that from our union's perspective, if you're a union officer working in automotive, you're not just seeing the impact in one employer, you're seeing it on a range of employers, and you're seeing the impact in the supply chain as well. So that's a good source of intelligence that the government needs to draw on. I would also say, actually, encouraging employers to think about how they engage staff in these conversations is going to be really important. I think wherever possible, avoiding unilateral decisions, taking short-term decisions. Our unions have done some really good agreements with the likes of, employers as diverse as Greg the Bakers, through to Hermes, a gig economy courier company, ISS, one of the big outsourcers, to think about what support are we going to offer staff, for example, when they have to self-isolate, when they do go off sick, and so on. Just to give you another example, yesterday we put 900 union reps through a webinar in terms of what they can practically do to support their members in the face of these issues. And I would encourage employers to see unions as a resource. Let's talk to each other at every level, at a workplace level. What's the impact? What can we do working together to mitigate that? Not to labour the point, but these are unprecedented times, and it does require a collective effort.
Can I just follow up on this point about how important it is to keep workers and businesses in touch, because Rain is right, and we will get through this, and at the end of it we need to have the infrastructure to rebuild our economy and get people back to work as quickly as possible. So as well as the income replacement helping people pay the bills and put food on the table during these difficult times, what are the arguments, Rain, that you would make for the income replacement scheme to keep workers and businesses attached? How important is that for rebuilding the economy afterwards?
Well, I think what I would say, I guess, coming back to some of the previous questions, to my mind, the focus is on trying to intervene before people become unemployed. Yeah. So that's why some of the measures that other governments have announced, once you become unemployed, we will provide the support. I think we should be thinking in a much more agile way to think about, what hopefully the Chancellor will announce, not building on some of the measures he's put in place for smaller businesses, but just being aware at the moment there's a big gap in terms of support for some of the very big employers who have had to close their doors essentially because of some of the measures that are happening. So I think we absolutely need to think about how we support before we get to that. And I think on, absolutely, how businesses and their employees get through this together, it's definitely a shared challenge. And I think just sharing some of the best practice that businesses themselves are putting in place, there's a huge amount of stress in all of this as well. And I think the support in terms of mental health of employees is absolutely critical. I can speak from experience in terms of what we know from businesses who've had operations in China and other countries that were affected earlier. So businesses are absolutely, conscious of that, increasing their support, and also making whatever adjustments they can to support people working from home. That's not possible in all industries, not possible in all businesses, but it's been amazing, I think, how quickly businesses have helped to facilitate that adjustment. But and that has to happen through a conversation with employees.
Thank you. Can I bring in Martin, then Alistair, and then Paul?
Yeah,
Martin.
I was just going to say that it's easy to get diverted onto some of the maybe more cold-blooded reactions from some of the larger corporates, but the reality is most people work for small businesses with less than 10 employees. A lot of those businesses are doing the right thing by their employees at some cost to themselves. And that's where the government needs to make sure that they're properly supported. I heard one example only yesterday of a pub that couldn't trade had decided to get its chef to start making pies to distribute to old ladies in the village. So, these are people who are responding in a humane way, but we don't want them to be the victims of this crisis.
Thank you, Martin. Alistair.
Just a small point to add to that on kind of, the corporate social responsibility element is One of the things that we noticed really early on is that there was a bit of a blind spot in terms of the government guidance that was being sent to employers, because it was very much, here is your advice for your employees, i.e. your full-time staff. And we had a lot of freelancers and self-employed people contact us and saying they were trying to engage with their clients, the companies that were using their services, and not really getting too much back. And I think there's simple things that if you are a big company that uses freelancers or slightly more contingent workers, that you should be thinking about already and not kind of sitting waiting for, good guidance from the government. So things like, don't cancel work with no notice. Make sure you're paying your freelancers on time. And on the payment issue as well, think about, is there ways that you can pay people perhaps up front for work rather than at the end of a project, so that people have a bit more cash flow coming in? How can you have that conversation around remote working and be sympathetic to people if they put in remote working requests, even if they're not a full-time employee? There's a whole range of kind of just basic good communications and good engagement that people should be having with their freelancers as well as their full-time employees as well. I think that's important.
I'll just make three quick points, Chair. One is I don't think you can put a price on goodwill, and actually staff who feel supported by their employer through these really difficult times, I think will recognise that and pay that back and appreciate it. But there are real costs, aren't there? If you make somebody redundant, or you then have to recruit somebody to replace the person you made redundant, that's an additional cost to employers that you want to avoid. So keeping people in employment is important. And then there are just some practical implications. I mean, one of our unions flagged with us yesterday that if you're working airside at an airport, you have to have a licence. If you're absent for 60 days, you have to go through the licensing process all over again. Now, at some stage, we'll want our airport open again. We'll want flights coming in and out of the UK, and we'll potentially find that we're in a situation where we haven't got the staff to work in the airports because people have got to go through those licensing processes. This is where understanding deeply about the issues within particular sectors is really important. I'm not an expert on the aviation industry or automotive or hospitality, but our union officers often are, and they should be used as a resource.
Thank you. Alan, did you have any further questions? Okay. Anna McMorran.
Thank you. I just want to turn to the gig economy again. We know that I think nearly 1 million people in this country, 970,000 people in this country are on 0-hour contracts. And they're currently facing a choice between self-isolation or continuing to work. Many of them will try and continue to work. Some may not be able to continue to work. What have you got any analysis? I know we touched on this slightly before, but have you got any analysis of the impact that this is going to have on the country with that entire economy collapsing? Shall I start with Rain?
I mean, I guess, our view is people's employment status shouldn't affect whether they're supported or not. We want to support everyone, regardless of whether they are workers, self-employed or employees. Obviously, the status of people on 0-hour contract, one of the challenges, it depends on the nature of their relationship. But I think that's the fundamental principle. We want to see people supported, whatever their employment status.
Yeah, well, I would echo that point, and I'd also point to practical examples where we've managed to, gig economy employees have done the right thing. So I mentioned Hermes before. Yeah. Hermes is, self-employed couriers. They don't normally pay sick pay. They reached an agreement with one of our unions, the GMB, that they would set aside £1 million to support people who had to self-isolate during this period of crisis. I think that's the right thing for them to do as an employer.
Aren't they only going to pay their workers £20 a day?
Well, I'm not sure of the details. I understood it was beyond that. But
£20 a day at the moment. I think that's what Hermes said. That's what I understand. I may be wrong.
No. As far as I'm aware, that they would. My understanding is that they would be paid normally out of that £1 million fund. It's something certainly we can check, Anna.
Yes.
That
would be good. We've got companies as well, like Deliveroo, for example, refusing to pay out to their drivers.
Yeah, and I think this is. I mean, it's a broader issue, isn't it? I mean, there's a very different set of issues for our unions who represent people who are genuinely self-employed, for example, in the entertainment industry. Alistair's members, and those that we would say actively are employed but are bogusly self-employed through those sort of platforms.
And that's something that this committee has looked at before, and,
yeah.
and I think that, you know, this pandemic does sort of throw into stark relief some of the challenges in the labour market for a lot of people who are now finding that because of their employment status, they don't have the protections that they need, and some of this, it does require legislation to clarify the status of workers.
It certainly does. Yeah, it certainly does. But our view has always been that, you know, employees should be considered to be employees unless the employer can demonstrably prove that they're not. But this is, in a way, when you've seen that shift of responsibility from employers to employees, this is the negative consequences of that. Obviously, that's a very different situation to those who are genuinely self-employed, who still need support as well.
Thank you. And you know, you rightly said the entertainment industry is going to be badly affected, as restaurants, bars, pubs. I know that in Cardiff, I've got that an individual who's just contacted me. She's about to go into massive debt because she runs the animation festival in Cardiff. She's got to take a decision. It's happening in a couple of weeks' time. She's got to take a decision whether to cancel it now without mandating, the government mandating that cancellation. She's very, very worried. What would you say to her, people like her, pubs, restaurants, theatres across the country?
It's an incredibly challenging issue. That I think if it's a business, then, as I say, we might see a bit more detail from government today. But the kind of schemes that were announced in terms of the business rates relief and loan schemes and things, those will potentially be a kind of a suitable option to that. But I mean, this is really tricky. I mean, we've been inundated in the last few days with reports from different sectors. We've had sports journalists get in touch who are not going to have anything to write about for the next few months. We've had people in the music industry, TV, creative, all across the board. We've also got a lot of people who are self-employed, cleaners and carers in this country, who are kind of right at the sharp edge of both the health and the economic part of this equation. So this is a real challenge for a lot of different areas at the moment.
I think any people want to come in now. If we take Martin, Paul and Rain, and Alan, I know you've got a supplementary question. I'll bring you in a minute. So, Martin.
I was going to add just a couple of points. I mean, if you're the average Uber driver and you've no income support and you're very fragile sort of personal finances, the temptation to go out and take a fare when you really maybe should be self-isolating yourself is very, very real. And I think government needs to take that kind of decision making, that behavioural stuff into account when making these decisions. And the other thing is that the government has announced a hardship fund distributed through local government. It's about £500 million, but it's very unclear how that will be distributed. And it's also it's piling yet more pressure on local government officers at a time when they seem to be under massive stress anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just in a taxi yesterday, a cooperative taxi company drive in Cardiff. The taxi driver is going to have to keep working because how does he afford to pay back the loan on his cab? Yeah. These are the questions that many people across the country are asking. So would you say that the government needs to mandate, therefore?
Well, I think the discussion we had earlier about income support is critical.
Yeah. Let me bring in Paul and then round.
Yeah, I was at a round table last night convened by the Mayor of London. There was lots of representatives from London employers there, including hospitality, culture, leisure sectors. I think there was concern that there was advice given for people not to go to bars, restaurants and theatres, but that there wasn't mandated that those establishments shut. It does present real problems to those employers. We may well see that advice change over the course of the next few days, and I think that will probably be right. But just to say, I think it does also highlight that whatever measures we put in place, there are going to be some people who slip, unfortunately, through the cracks, and who are going to be facing real problems with rent or mortgage or debt. And again, I think, as well as looking at support for employers and employees at work, the government is also going to have to think long and hard about what happens when people do fall behind with their mortgage payments through no fault of their own. And that short-term support has got to be there for people, because we don't want anybody losing their home, or, you know, for whatever reason, but certainly not in the face of a public health crisis.
I'm keen that we come on and talk about what we need from the banks, as well as people in the private rented sector. And I think Richard's got some questions about that in a bit. Rain, did you want to come in on Anna's point?
Just briefly, I think absolutely everyone acknowledges we've got to do whatever it takes to address the health crisis we are facing. So, you know, businesses, employees, we all support the measures that need to be put in place around social distancing. But there's no doubt that the manner in which the announcement was made yesterday, I think, caused unnecessary stress, because it did put the burden of responsibility very late in the day on theatres, on pubs, on individual businesses and employees to take a really tough call very late in the day. And I think as we go forward, we just need to minimise that sort of stress being placed on people who are trying to make tough decisions. And I think, you know, the government does need to step in and lead on that and have clear communication. And I think it also has created challenges around insurance. And we'll maybe come on to talk about that in more detail. But absolutely right now, we need the government to be convening the insurers. The Association of British Insurers would absolutely stand ready to help to think about how we solve some of the issues we're going to see play out around insurance. And I think that's where we need to see. And I think the other thing I would pick up is, you know, there are lots of sectors that, you know, don't always get the limelight, or we haven't really considered who are being affected. So whether that's universities who are not able to go to, you know, to attract students from overseas. There are so many sectors that have been affected by events needing to be cancelled. Lots of smaller businesses that run kids clubs. There are so many different areas that I think we really need to think through them all.
Alan, briefly, and then I just want to pick up this issue about insurance and mandating businesses to close. Alan.
I think that's maybe aimed at yourself, Martin. An accountant got in touch with me and he flagged up that he thinks a lot of businesses are going to have trouble getting up when they get audited, because it's going to be difficult to show they're still a going concern after you've such a drop in income and all the rest of it. And he was suggesting maybe need to have a relaxation of time frames for lodging files at Companies House. So I'm just wondering if that is a measure that could help businesses, you know, in terms of the penalties that would normally be applied, getting relaxed.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you've got to allow businesses to focus on the critical things rather than the more bureaucratic sort of judgments they'd have to make day to day. I mean, one example for a lot of self-employed people, there's a payment due in July for most of them. It would be a really good message to go out to all the self-employed to say, look, you know, that July payment won't need to be made. We're prepared to extend that. And that would take a lot of pressure off a lot of self-employed people.
Thank you. We contacted the Association of British Insurers this morning because of this session and some of the concerns around the businesses we've been talking about, the pubs, the restaurants, the theatres, etc. Now, obviously the concerns of those businesses is that unless the government mandates them to close, they're not going to be able to claim on their insurance. But the Association of British Insurers has said to us this morning, and I just read this first paragraph of their email to me and then a couple of extra points. Commercial insurance policies provide cover against a wide range of risks that can be tailored to the needs of individual businesses, including extensions to cover. Businesses who are concerned about the impacts of COVID-19 should, in the first instance, check the scope of their cover and check with their insurance advisor or broker. Standard business insurance policies are designed and priced to cover standard risks and are therefore unlikely to provide cover for the effects of global pandemics like COVID-19. Is that the understanding, Ray Newton-Smith, of your businesses, that even if the government mandated them to close, that they wouldn't be covered for global pandemics like COVID-19?
We've certainly picked up from a range of businesses that they are very concerned that they're not covered for closures around COVID-19. I think you're absolutely right. It's one of these things where the status isn't entirely clear, and so it's not clear whether mandating the closures would help solve. It certainly wouldn't solve all of the insurance issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They go on to say in the course of the email sent to us this morning, and we'll look to publish this, a small number of businesses may have cover in place that will specifically provide for business interruptions arising from notifiable diseases. However, this type of extension is not commonly included as standard. And they go on to say insurance of business interruption resulting from COVID-19 is likely to be rare. And so the hope, the understandable hope from many businesses that being mandated to close will then enable them to claim on their insurance. What we're hearing from the ABI just this morning is that things might not be as simple as that. In which case, Alistair, your members, many of whom might be freelancers, actors, musicians, Paul Nowak, many of your members, I think the musicians' unions say that 90% of their members are self-employed, wouldn't therefore be able to get perhaps compensation that would be able to be claimed on insurance by the theatres, etc. How serious is this, Ray Newton-Smith, for the viability of hospitality, of theatre and entertainment venues? Would they be able to get through this if they were mandated to close but were not able to claim on their insurance?
Look, I think there's already, even before as the announcements yesterday, there are already some businesses that are under huge pressure. We know, from the hotel industry, bookings are down by 70%. You take the airline industry, it's catastrophic. So I think there's already pressures out there that insurance isn't going, and a lot of those are not cases where you can, where insurance is necessarily going to fit the, to foot the bill. So no, there is absolutely a huge challenge across a lot of different sectors, both from how events have played out so far, but obviously as social distancing measures rightly need to be put in place, that's going to put even more pressure on lots of different businesses.
I mean, these parts of our economy are increasingly important for our national income and for employment, and also about who we are as a country and our culture. If businesses are not going to be mandated to close, or if they are mandated to close but they're not able to claim on their insurance, what sort of package of measures would the CBI and IPSE and the TUC be looking for specifically to support our cultural sector so that at the end of this we still have theatres and clubs and entertainment venues and that crucial part of our economy, but also our cultural life?
So I think it's a few things. It's absolutely doing everything it takes to support those businesses now, so that we can think to where we are in 6 months' time and still have, the vibrant economy and culture that we want to see in this country. And I think some of the immediate measures they could do is, I would absolutely be looking at business rates. They've given relief. You don't have to pay this year if you have a property that's rateable at £50,000 or lower. You could raise that to 100,000, because some of the challenges, particularly in London and in some areas, you have very high value properties, particularly if it's a hotel, for example, where the rateable value is a lot higher. So that's one very practical thing the government can look at. They could also look at providing a business rates holiday, so just deferring the payment across sectors for a period of 3 months. And so that would really help with the cash flow for a lot of these businesses and help to protect as many jobs as possible. I think also looking at what measures you can provide in terms of loan guarantees that might be backed by the government, but providing through the banking sector is absolutely something we should look at. There's a very specific point as well, also looking around insolvency law. So at the moment you look ahead 13 weeks in terms of insolvencies. You could extend that to 26 weeks. I think there are some practical things you could do around regulation to try and help to buy these businesses more time to get through where we are. And finally, on the insurance, I think we probably can't solve all of the problems immediately, but what I would want people to think about is, if you look internationally and if you look what we've done in the past around floods with Pool Ray and others, there are ways that you can provide co-insurance for industries, and I think it's something we should be absolutely getting, the insurers together with the government and thinking, is there any way the government can provide some kind of scheme to ensure?
And is there precedent there, Rain, about the government coming in and supporting insurers or businesses if some of a natural disaster or a terrorist incident, for example, that may not be claimable on your insurance, but the government could step in and provide some sort of emergency cover?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen it happen in the past, as you're pointing out, in terms of flood risk. If we've seen it as well around terrorism, and I think right now we really need the best minds possible to be trying to solve some of these problems in real time. And there's lots of things on the regulatory space where I think we need to think about how we have some flexibility in the rules because of the unusual circumstances we're facing. And one just a simple illustration of that is people who are self-isolating. You cannot get a gas inspector to those properties to provide a gas safety certificate. So the housing associations are saying that you need to give us you've got to say, we're not going to cut off gas supply to these houses. That would be the worst thing we can do. Therefore, we're just going to ignore that rule for a while, even though your gas safety certificate has. But at the moment, they feel like they're taking the risk of taking that action. And so I think we do need the government in constant dialogue with business to try and fix some of these regulatory problems that are going to happen as well.
That's a good point. But I'll bring in Mark Horsey now.
I'd like to go back to the points that Adam McMurrin was making about the preparedness of those working in small businesses, the self-employed and the gig economy, to deal with the situation that they face. And many people choose to be self-employed. They benefit in boom times. They can do very well when the sector they work in is in growth, or there may be a shortage of skills. We hear about bricklayers in times of booming construction doing particularly well, and so they are there to have the opportunity to make hay when the sun shines in a way that somebody who's employed may not. But of course the downside of that is that they don't receive holiday pay and they don't receive sick pay. I'm interested in to what extent this situation is different. And Martin, you did speak about some people who are self-employed perhaps prioritising income over health. And we've just had a discussion about insurance. Of course, many people who are self-employed could insure their own health to make certain that in the event of their sickness, their policy would then cover them for not being able to work. So have the self-employed and small businesses thought enough about the consequences of an event such as this, and has this event brought into focus whether or not we need to consider changes to the way that people do work?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is no, they haven't thought at all about these. But then the reality is...
But people who do go into self-employment do understand the difference in their employment status, Martin, don't they?
I think most people do, and most people accept that the additional freedom they get is worth that loss of security. But the one thing that's absolutely common across most small businesses is their time horizon's very short. They very rarely think about rare outcomes or something that's going to happen a long way in the future. And take business interruption insurance. That's been on the market for a long time. There are very few businesses that I know that take it up. And even now, some apparently that have got it are struggling to get
and how many
claims.
Self-employed for people who run small businesses might have their own health insurance to cover them personally in the event that they're unable to work?
They would have health insurance. There would be a significant number that would have health insurance. I think in these circumstances, the test is whether that is going to help them. Their individual health, they may be able to get some health cover for themselves. But if they've got a business employing 10 people and they can't pay the bills, and there's a lot of overheads that are going to keep rolling on, whatever their individual situation is, I don't think their individual health insurance is going to help them.
And Alistair, your members?
Yeah, I think on the insurance point, I can perhaps see if we've got any research on kind of the number of self-employed people that, when we've done surveys in the past, will have insurances and things, because I think it's a bit of I think it would be a bit of a mixed picture, and kind of different depending on different sectors and things like that. But on the bigger point about this trade-off between the freedom and flexibility of setting up your own business, being self-employed, and the risks of the downside. I think broadly speaking, most people are aware of it. You know, there's been a huge rise in the last few years in the number of people going into self-employment. We're now over kind of 5 million people, and that's a mix of part-time people who might be doing it in addition to a full-time job, in addition to people who are doing it full-time. And above all, they say that they do it for the freedom and flexibility. I think the issue is, in normal times with a recession, or if there's a kind of brief downturn, I think that essential trade-off of being in charge of your own affairs and kind of looking out for your own finances versus not having that employee type safety net is one that most people think is, you know, a reasonable one on the balance. I think this is such a specific and, you know, challenging few months that we're heading into that we need to think creatively about how people who don't have access to a basic level of support will manage through the next few months. And I think that's why we're keen to keep the discussion, as I say, the sick pay point, extending that to self-employed is a useful thing. You know, we're not saying that that's a bad idea for the duration of this crisis, but we think that's kind of, you know, we don't want to miss the wood for the trees here, if that's the right way that metaphor goes around. You know, the big issue here is we're going to be seeing very sudden, big loss of income from people who are otherwise running pretty good, you know, well-maintained businesses, and that's through no fault of their own. And so we need to almost try and freeze the current situation for, you know, hopefully a reasonable period of time, so that once things are better, they will eventually kind of return to some kind of normality, that we can kind of pick up where we left off. I think that's where we're trying to get to.
Cool. Yeah, just to come in on that one, certainly our unions do represent freelancers, for example, in the music industry, the film industry, in front of the camera, in front of the microphone, but also the people who work behind the scenes as well. Certainly we've heard examples, and I can provide them to the committee if useful, of people who have taken out insurance for if a gig is cancelled, a job isn't delivered, where they've been told they can't claim on that insurance, and so we can happily provide that to the committee. But to my mind, if you take a sector like the culture sector, creative industries, you're going to have to design a package of support for employment that covers freelancers and contractors as well as the directly employed. And this is where I think the importance of having that sectoral dialogue is really important, because that package of support is going to look very different than the package of support you put in place for the chemicals industry, for example, or in food manufacturing. Just one sort of additional sort of point to make. I think what's come out of this whole discussion today is that this isn't business as usual for anybody. It's not business as usual for employers, for employees, for governments. I don't think it should be business as usual for the insurance industry as well, and hopefully the government will be engaging the industry positively to think about, because actually providing support to a relatively small number of insurance companies might be a hell of a lot easier than trying to pick up the pieces of tens of thousands of small businesses that are under pressure.
So what you're suggesting, Paul Nowak, is potentially the government could say to the insurers, stand behind the businesses who are trying to claim but can't because their global pandemics aren't included.
And say, we'll talk to
cover.
the industry about what support you need.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Can
Mark?
I come on to ask about home working, because the government are placing a lot of emphasis on homework, and it strikes me that, Alistair, most of your members do that. So, and Rain, many of your members will be encouraging people to homework. So the question is, how prepared are they? Is there enough equipment? Is broadband adequate? And what lessons can people who are suddenly home working, who've perhaps been in the comfort of an office situation throughout their working career, suddenly being asked to work out, what support can people like Alistair's members, who have been doing that for years, be able to provide in terms of perhaps their personal well-being and you know, keeping them fit and well while they're totally transforming the way in which they work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to cover most of that. So businesses are absolutely trying to do as much as they can to support home working. Obviously, in some sectors like business and professional services, it's very easy for them to do that and to make those adjustments, and they went very early to move all of their staff to work from home. And I think what we're seeing within our own members is a lot of sharing of best practice in terms of how you make that work effectively. There are some logistical challenges. So, for instance, around laptops, there is, you know, a sort of shortage, because obviously there has been a big increase in demand for laptops. So there's some practical issues. I think the other thing to consider as well is it can be easy to, so for some households it's not that easy to work from home because of your personal circumstances, and I think that's something we don't always consider. And we're coming out of winter, but there's a whole set of issues around heating your home which you might not have been doing prior, and so I think how businesses help their employees through some of those issues and how we have kind of honest conversations around that. And for some, if you're in a shared household, it can be a bit more of a stressful situation than when you were able to go into a place of work. So I think everyone's got to be mindful of that. We've certainly had a lot of concern around broadband from individual employers. Will it work? I think one of the challenges is honestly, I think the biggest demand around broadband is when people are at home in the evenings and streaming films and videos. So I've yet to see the evidence as to whether that actually is a critical issue, though people have certainly raised the question. So I think it's something we have to look, but it does speak to this issue about the faster we can get super fast broadband to all households, the more robust and better position we're going to be in.
Members help?
Yeah, we did a report on remote working actually towards the end of last year, and there's a huge number of freelancers who are able to work predominantly from home, and there's a few that use kind of co-working spaces, but actually the shift has been mostly to work from home. And there's a few challenges around it. Broadband is definitely one that's a perennial issue that we hear from our members, particularly those who are working in rural areas, as you'd expect. But yeah, we're at the moment at IPSE where we're trying to kind of collate as much of this information as possible, and also if it's helpful for us to share, best practice from our freelancers who've been home working for a number of years with, employees who suddenly find that they'll be having to do it for a period of months. We'd be more than happy to share that with CDI and other employers' organisations.
And loneliness that somebody may experience from working in an busy office environment to then spending all day on their own.
Yeah, it's really challenging. I think the one thing that can be really helpful with that is finding online communities, particularly ones where it's people who are doing a similar job to you. I know that freelancers, there's a lot of discussion online at the moment, a lot of concerns and worries as well, but actually there is another side to this, which is a sense that if we all kind of be quite kind to each other and kind of support each other as much as we can through this, then we can kind of make this a little bit easier. So there's a lot of those kind of discussions happening online as well.
To be fair, Mark, I've heard the opposite problem with people being thrown into a very close proximity with their family and trying to work. That's not easy either.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
Thanks, Jen.
You don't want to comment? Richard, can I bring you in, talk about the banks?
Yes, the banks, we sort of touched on banks, but interestingly hasn't been central to most of the commentary that's made. Rain, maybe you just want to start on, are banks critical? What would you like to see them do that they're not doing, and how do you think some of the impediments can be overcome that we've already highlighted?
I'm glad you raised it, because it was one of the points I absolutely wanted to come back with. I think the action by banks is absolutely critical, and also the work by the Bank of England and the Treasury. And I think actually we've seen a lot of positive action by banks that happened even before we saw the Bank of England and the Treasury take action last week. So whether it's RBS or NatWest have put in place, have said that they will, they will look at extended, allowing people to defer mortgage payments, allowing people to defer loan payments. And I think it's RBS have put together a £5 billion fund to support businesses through that, and households as well. So I think a lot of banks have been quite proactive in trying to provide as much relief that they can provide to both to households and businesses, and I think that's really welcome. I think the measures that the Bank of England took were really important. So the cut in interest rate is probably, in a way, not one of the biggest factors that will help cash flow through the economy, but I think extending the term funding scheme was really important, because that's a way of trying to get that lower interest rate being passed through the banking system to households and to businesses, and that was really welcome. And also reducing the counter-cyclical buffer, essentially reducing the reserve requirement for banks. Again, it's another way of getting more liquidity in the system, and I think the actions we've seen this week in terms of the G7 central banks working in a coordinated way to provide liquidity to the global market is really is really important. So I think we've seen some good developments. I think it's as we move from here, it's absolutely thinking how we can get, fiscal policy working through the banking system to provide the liquidity that businesses and households need.
Before broadening out for others who may wish to comment, the government, when it announced the Business Interruption Loan Scheme, put a £41 million revenue limit on those who could apply. I don't know if you have any comments on that. And second of all, obviously you don't speak for the banks, but many businesses will have loan covenants that will be breached over the next quarter, high likelihood. Is there any thoughts the CBI have had about how banks should handle loan covenants?
I don't think it's something we could come back to and maybe provide some written evidence. I don't have anything I think I can say that's helpful at this stage around loan covenants. I think on certainly echoing some of the points other people have made, there's certainly a lot of confusion around the criteria for how the £1 billion fund that will be channeled out through the British Business Bank, but I think it's also coming through local, provided through local authorities, and also the £5 billion emergency fund. What the criteria are for people to access that, how they access it, and we're certainly trying to play our part providing that information. But I think a lot of the details haven't been worked out, and yet we've got businesses on the one hand who are going, potentially going to the wall at the moment with flights being grounded and businesses shut. So I think we do need to be more agile in how we provide some of that liquidity to businesses now to help us through where we will end up.
Martin, at the other end, small businesses are notoriously loan shy, despite the best efforts of successive governments to encourage greater access to loans. You talked earlier on about the message not getting through on the ground in some of the banks. Are the schemes that have been announced by the government and the implementation of that sufficient, well targeted, correctly targeted, or are they going to be either too little or too late?
No, we welcomed them at the budget announcement. We thought there was a really good package or variety of different supports that we think were very useful to small businesses. The one area that it seems to have come unstuck is this COVID disruption loans, where it's clear that at sort of branch level, relationship manager level, they really don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. And there is a real mix about who qualifies and doesn't qualify under what circumstances. And I think although it appears that at chief exec level at the big seven banks, they seem to understand how the system works, it's not getting down to the grassroots level. And those loans could be absolutely critical in the coming months, because although we've got about 50% permanent non-borrowers at the moment among small businesses generally, that doesn't mean they're not thinking of those as a possibility. A lot of them will have existing facilities guaranteed by the banks. I hear Chief Exec the other day saying to me before this crisis that there was a lot of guaranteed borrowing still out there that people weren't taking advantage of. Now, if I was a typical small business and I'm thinking I'm going to hit a rainy day anytime soon, I'm going to want to tap into that facility. Will it still be there? I don't know. At the moment, a lot of them don't know. And I think that has to be a lot clearer.
Maybe more broadly on banks, the French government and the German government have announced very extensive loan guarantee schemes, up to 80% of loans being guaranteed. If you think of those numbers compared to the numbers that were in the budget just here last week, they are of an order of magnitude different. Is the expectation across the British economy now that the Chancellor should be announcing that scale of support?
Well, I would say yes. And some of this sort of stuff really practically matters to our members. We'll be doing more work, which we'll publish later this week, on some of these practical issues. But, where is the flexibility going to be, for example, if somebody doesn't get paid or doesn't get paid what they were expecting to be paid, and they've got payments going out the other end, and what can banks help to do to support people in the short term? There's a broader set of issues, Richard, which I said we need to do more work on at the TUC and with our unions, just thinking about things like pensions and people who are expecting to retire on defined contribution pensions, and what does that mean, looking at the state of the markets and where the market's going to be over the next few months. So I said before, unprecedented times mean unprecedented measures, and I think that, these are a broader set of issues which I'm certainly not expert on, but which we want to do more work on.
Richard? Oh, sorry.
No,
Rain, and then
Rain.
bring Richard back in.
Alistair and then
So I think it's something the government absolutely needs to look at. I think our sense from what we're seeing in the banking sector and also the sort of demand for credit as well is that while there's a lot of concern coming down the track and there are some individual businesses, it's not clear that just getting access to finance through the banking system is the biggest issue for some of these businesses. I think it potentially is a challenge. I think for some of them it's not just about cash flow, it's about the hit to their costs, the cost they're paying versus their revenue more broadly and a bit more fundamental than that. And that's why I think the biggest gap, there were some really helpful measures in the budget to support smaller businesses, but it was quite silent on some of the larger businesses. And so that's where we see the gap at the moment. Of course, the challenge for the government is there are demands, as we are hearing this morning, from across different sectors, across different sizes of businesses, and their biggest challenge is prioritising those demands. And I think some of the things they should be looking at, I mentioned some of the policy measures they could do. If they make that blanket for every single business, some of those measures are expensive for the government. I think how they should be prioritising it is thinking about, where are sectors facing critical issues because they've been asked to close, where they've had flights grounded, where, which sectors are really impacted from the social distancing measures that have been announced already. And who's next coming down the track. And then there may be other ways you can prioritise, just looking at, it's hard to get this data always in real time, but looking at the extent that sales have been hit, for example, if sales have fallen by 25%, is there any way you can use sort of data that firms would be able to provide that are quite clear, simple criteria, so businesses could know whether they're eligible for some of these reliefs and funding mechanisms.
Thank you.
I think, just really briefly and reiterate what I've said before. In terms of the self-employed, I just stress again the need for it to be tailored to that population, because there are a lot of self-employed people who, in terms of how often they'll go to their bank, it will really only be for, one or two accounts that's the money that goes in, and then they kind of manage it as it comes out from there. So beyond kind of overdraft facilities, I'm, again, slightly wary of setting up either on government or business side big sort of business loan style schemes that then they may be slightly nervous about kind of knowing how to access and even taking if there is kind of funds available there as well.
Chair, just talking about banks, in a way, as we go through this crisis, we move from a cash flow issue to balance sheet issue and recovery. And the role of the banks may be more extensive in dealing with the recovery than perhaps in this immediate period. And we've touched on issues, I think Mr. Nowak did, about pensions, Ms. Newton-Smith, about the fact some of these measures are expensive, which means taxes will have to be potentially raised to contribute back. What thought I know it's early, but what thought is being given to, after this period of crisis, the issues that we're going to confront in that recovery phase?
So just one issue that sort of I think sort of struck me watching the budget last week is that a lot of focus on, for example, rates relief, which is absolutely essential for lots of high street businesses and small businesses. That potentially is going to have a real impact on local authority finances, local authorities that are already under real financial pressure. So I think it's important to do in the short term. I think longer term, one of the things I'd be looking at the government, and it's not necessarily the sort of purview of this committee, but its importance is what does this mean for local government finances? Because local government will be spending a lot right now up front to try and provide support to the most vulnerable to keep basic services running. If you have a large number of businesses who are paying little or no rates over the course of the next 6, 12 months, whatever it might be, that's going to have a real impact on those local government finances. And that's certainly one thing I think government should be thinking about, when we have the next financial event or mini budget or whatever it might be.
Thank you. Richard, have you got any further questions? Or?
No, that was my last question. Any other thoughts? That's my last question.
Oh, sorry. Rain, you come in and then I'll bring Pat in.
Yeah. So I think just on that wider point, I think that's why we need to be as agile as we can in supporting households and the economy now, because if we can support growth in the immediate term, then that will help us over the long. I think we know that the economic impact of this should be V-shaped, right? I mean, it's going to be short, it's going to be intense over these coming few weeks. If we can support the economy as much as we can, that should help us be in a stronger position over the long term, and therefore help our ability to fund public services over the long term. But I think you're absolutely right to raise some of the long-term issues. And I think what was really welcome in the budget last week is that the Chancellor did make some important issues on long-term spending. So there was lots of measures to support R&D, lots of measures around infrastructure spending, and I think that also gives businesses confidence that the government is thinking to the long term as well and isn't afraid to make some of those decisions. So I think we've got to recognise that that was really welcome. I think there were some areas on the longer term where we'd like to see more action from the government, and maybe that's in the comprehensive spending review, but it's absolutely around skills and the wider area around energy efficiency. The overall measures in terms of the move to a low carbon economy, there weren't that many specifics in the budget. So I think I don't envy the government and politicians in terms of the difficult decisions they have to make, but I think keeping an eye to that long term, making some of those critical decisions while dealing with the immediate crisis is the absolute balancing act we need to have.
Thank you. Can I bring in Pat McFadden?
Just on this matter of business as usual, either for the banks, as Richard Fuller was saying, we talked about insurance companies a few minutes ago. Can I ask you about the courts? Normally, if someone doesn't keep up rent payments, they are liable to have their tenancy taken away from them, either on their home or their business. If you don't keep up mortgage payments, you may lose your home. I think that's written into every mortgage agreement. But it would be appalling if people were to lose their homes or their businesses because of this situation. Do you think, in terms of not regarding this as business as usual, that we need to see a flexible response from the courts as well as from the bits of the financial system that we've discussed?
I think from a self-employed perspective, the rent issue is a key one that we're getting kind of increasing noises of concern about. I think, and obviously there was some announcements on mortgages in the budget and nothing on rent. I think what it probably does, for a lot of self-employed people, and when we've surveyed them in the past, rent is one of the big things that comes out. And in some sectors like the creative industries, even if you miss a couple of payments, that can often put you close to not being able to cover that. I think what this highlights is if we get to a situation where there's a kind of, threadbare cost replacement, so if people are just having to rely on kind of a welfare, limit of £95 if it's sick pay or lower, but they're still then missing the rent. And we then get into these questions about, does that mean that it will end up in the courts? I think the risk then is you get into a kind of knock-on series of policy choices, which is then, does this mean we should have rent relief? Does this mean we should have temporary relief on this? I think part of the logic behind why we're calling for something which is a bit higher level, a kind of something that's close to, income protection, temporary income protection fund that can cover essentially what you're earning, is that it means that you can carry on as normal and that you don't have to then deal with all these second and third order kind of policy choices. That's kind of the approach that we're taking. So on the point about rent, I can't say in terms of the details of what that will mean for the courts and things like that.
Question.
But I think this is, I do think this is the key thing. We want to keep income as stable and continuous as possible, so that we're then not getting tipped into all these other considerations which then flow from it.
And just to say on that part, I think trying to keep it out of the courts is the key thing, and it does speak exactly as Alistair said to some of these things we talked about: support for short-time working, income protection, and also a safety net for those people who, for whatever reason, that isn't enough, who do end up missing mortgage or rent payments. But you would hope that banks and landlords alike would show some flexibility over the next 3 to 4 months, that there are going to be lots of people under pressure, and you wouldn't take a decision how to move to the courts to evict somebody because they missed a month's mortgage payments.
Thank you.
More broadly than that, there are also going to be people who might be struggling with their gas and electricity bills, water, also potentially with TV licences and broadband. What advice are you giving to people about those? And perhaps, Ray Newton-Smith, what advice would you give to your larger members, the gas and electricity companies, the broadband providers, about ensuring that both business customers and households are not cut off from these essential services at this very difficult time for people? Perhaps broadband, more importantly than ever. The others are sort of obvious, but if people are going to be at home self-isolating, they'll need to be able to order groceries online, they'll need to be able to get information online, because there won't be other ways for them to get that sort of information. So what advice would you give to your members who offer provide those services?
So I think one of the things we absolutely need to see, and that our members are encouraging, is businesses where you are able to is paying is prompt payment. So for businesses of all sizes, particularly obviously the larger businesses, to ensure that they are paying invoices where they can as soon as possible, because that just helps to it helps the smaller businesses who will be facing serious cash flow issues. So I think that's absolutely something we need to encourage. I think, look, on businesses and landlords, etc., but exercising forbearance where they can, absolutely, to try and support individuals and businesses through this. Of course, the challenge, for some businesses is, they can't, at the same time, they're trying to provide employment and trying to be a viable business. So, they can provide what leniency they can, but if their business is themselves about to go under, then they will also be under pressure. And
I would have thought that those industries are likely to be the ones who aren't going to see a fall in their demand. In fact, perhaps the contrary.
So I wasn't. That's not a comment on those particular industries. It's more about the sort of wider principle.
Paul Nowak.
Yeah, my only observation, Chair, would be I don't think it's sufficient to leave it to a company by company response and hope that they do the right thing. I mean, I think this is where you do use the convening power of governments to say, across the water companies, across the electricity companies, what is our common approach to these issues going to be over the next 3 to 4 months? That would seem to me the most sensible sort of approach, because it shouldn't depend on your postcard code or where you live in the country or which broadband provider you have for the response on those sort of really important issues. So I think, again, this isn't necessarily about government money, it's about government convening power and bringing those key utility providers together with a common response.
Thank you very much, Paul. Martin McTague, and then I'll bring Peter Kyle in.
Yeah, it's just, I didn't think Rain had mentioned this first, but I'm glad she did. Prompt payment is absolutely critical, because if we're going to start ploughing money into businesses that are being starved of cash from their customers, then that's a crazy situation to be in. And in many situations, even down to, purchase clerks in big businesses that will go off sick and then invoices get left unpaid. This is really simple to fix. Pay as quickly as you can for the smallest suppliers, and that should be something that government can say very quickly to every business.
Thank you. And again, Martin, this committee in the last Parliament did a lot of work on that, and very critical of many large businesses who were either not signatories to the prompt payment code, or if they were signatories, they didn't fulfil their obligations to it. So I think that's a welcome reminder that big businesses have got a lot of power, and with that power comes some responsibility to support smaller businesses and the whole supply chain. Thank you. Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Chair. Paul, you said a few moments ago that the Chancellor has a lot to consider before his next mini-budget. Well, it looks like we're going to get a mini-budget today. It looks like we're going to get a mini-budget probably every week from now through to summer. And if we're not, then something's going wrong, because I suspect this is going to be fast-moving. So this is a question to you and then the rest of the panel. Have you been consulted extensively by government on what you would like to see as this situation unfolds? Has it been a constructive engagement between yourselves and government? And are they listening? And do you feel that you and the people you represent are being listened to?
I wouldn't say that we've been consulted extensively. I think there's been consultations. I mentioned before the engagement, for example, that we had with DFT. I'm due to speak to BEIS officials later today. I think there's a need to sort of put this onto a proper footing, Peter, and for it not to be so ad hoc. And this is why we've made the call for a national task force, because I think it's important we're not just responding issue by issue, sector by sector, but that we are sitting down in a room and trying to identify where the pressure points are going to be over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks and beyond. So, these are difficult times for the government, and I'm always reluctant to say that the response is therefore we need more dialogue in another committee, because people are getting on with the job. But there is a real need to get the key stakeholders together. I think if you're serious about protecting jobs and livelihoods, whether it is in manufacturing or distribution or transport or aviation or whatever it might be, having the right people in the room matters.
Thank you, Ray.
There's been a huge increase in the engagement we've had, and we're in sort of daily contact with the Treasury and with BEIS, where we're both sharing the information that we're seeing on how the economy is being impacted, how different businesses are being impacted, and some of the policy ideas that our members are putting forward. So I think the good news is absolutely the communication has really stepped up. I think I'd certainly agree, with what Paul is saying, that this is a huge challenge across so many different government departments. And it does feel like at the moment we could have a better structure and a better way of feeding that information in. I think like Paul, is a task force the right way to do it? It may well be, but I think certainly what we see is the need for a bit more structure, a bit more coherence. But I think what we absolutely want to see is just that information flow going into
You say it stepped up. When did it really start? When did you first start engaging regularly, specifically on coronavirus with government?
I think it's hard for me to say exactly. Obviously, because of where we were with the budget, we're constantly coming up with ideas and discussing some of the economic analysis that we produce with Treasury teams ahead of a budget anyway. I would say it's really over the last 2 or 3 weeks where I think everyone is coming together and just seeing that we do have a crisis that's affecting the country, and everyone wants to help.
So in that time frame, we could assume that when Italy started to succumb to the virus and its economy started to be profoundly, but that's the point at which the government started to really start engaging in a...
I think there was a step up in the engagement, but it had already stepped up before then. It wasn't just what was happening with Italy. And I think where we've hopefully also been able to play a role is obviously we're talking with Confindustria and some of the other business organisations across Europe about some of the challenges they've been facing, how they've responded. And I think there's just such an awareness that we've all got to work as hard as we can together to solve these problems as they arise.
Alistair?
Well, we wrote to the Secretary of State for Health and for Department for Work and Pensions on the 27th of February, because we were getting, which seems like a lifetime ago now, kind of initial feedback that there was concerns about a lack of guidance for the self-employed. We haven't had a response to that. I mean, possibly understandable given the circumstances, but on the coronavirus issue, we've found consultation really lacking. We've had engagement with other bits of government on kind of business as usual policy areas like late payment and IR35 and various other bits and pieces. But we would really like to be, we're here, we've got a voice that's, trying to represent freelancers and self-employed people. We're getting information in all the time, and we think, if that's kind of real-time, useful information that we think could help government inform.
By the 27th of February, we had already had our first outbreak in this country, in Brighton, where we'd had 7 cases confirmed, and then elsewhere in the country. And so that was the point at which there was still no meaningful dialogue between yourselves and government.
Yeah, and we still have had very little, to be honest. I think it's a tricky thing. I really don't want to kind of pile in on the government because this is a huge, difficult issue. But, you know, we see as a trade association for self-employed people, the self-employed and freelancers are very often left out of the discussion when it comes to government policy making. They cannot be at this stage because there are real kind of serious questions about people's livelihoods that will be on the line in the next few months. So we're more than happy to help and come and engage. If there's a task force, we would be, you know, one of the first people to be happy to sign up.
You can see how constructive the committee has been from the tone of this meeting. We're certainly very grateful for you for the way you've been very open with this. The Secretary of State for Health yesterday in his statement made it very, very clear that he expected opposition MPs to ask tough questions because that's where the learning is. And I think the same approach needs to extend to stakeholders because unless we're having a robust, frank conversation now, then things will get missed on the front line. And we know full well, and nobody more so than you, what that means for the people you represent.
Yeah.
Well, I think I can't really fault the engagement. It's significantly stepped up in early February. It's we're now on sort of daily calls. So I think the government's engagement with us, the fact that we can provide a lot of evidence, you know, with 160,000 members, we can provide a lot of practical examples of how these measures are impacting and how they're responding. I think it's been a very positive relationship.
And do you feel that the advice you give is heeded? It leads to action?
At the moment, what we're trying to do is explain the problems, some solutions, and I think they are actively considering those solutions. What we can't do is provide a fix for every problem that's currently the country's undergoing.
Okay.
What we're trying to do is give the best possible evidence.
I understand. A specific question for you, Rain, just to wrap up on hospitality. The announcement yesterday was difficult. Obviously, I represent the city of Brighton and Hove, which is deeply affected by hospitality. The message the message is many messages I've got from people running small businesses, whether it be pubs, clubs, you know, activities in hotels. Was yesterday that the government have said that their businesses are unsafe, but haven't closed them. I don't know anybody in hospitality that thinks that was leadership from the government in the way that they had expected. Is it your belief? And I think from what you said earlier, it would be fair to assume that what the government should have done is either give specific instructions to customers to be more resilient in places like this, or to shut them altogether, which has been done, you know, across Europe. Is that correct?
So I think what I would say is, just to echo earlier, I think the engagement between government and business has absolutely stepped up, and we are in daily contact with Treasury and BEIS, which is really helpful. But I think that it's only a few hours since what happened yesterday, and you know, days move fast. But I think I go back to what I did say earlier. I don't think the announcement yesterday was well handled. I think it has caused a lot of stress for businesses in the hospitality sector. You could certainly hear that from the voices that were on the radio and others yesterday. So can the government learn from how that announcement was made and articulated to people yesterday? Absolutely.
It wasn't really articulating. They're telling customers from an entire sector of our economy to stay away, but not close the business. And by doing so, have sort of abrogated themselves the responsibility for caring for the business for which they were responsible for shutting.
So, as I said, I think the challenge is it puts the burden of responsibility on the individual businesses and adds to the stress and the calls that they have to make. On the other hand, I guess the thing we have to be mindful of is I think the government's guidance on working from home, for example, at the moment, is something where you absolutely want the government to encourage businesses to do all they can to allow people to work from home, but you don't want to mandate it. And why is that? Because some of our critical services could not be delivered from home, and whether that's trains to get and buses to get our NHS workers to hospital, whether that's food to get to critical health workers.
Specifically on hospitality, I think the other thing that's not recognised is that actually a lot of these businesses people have huge affection for them. A lot of these businesses are very, very close to people's homes. They're deeply rooted in communities. So, we know full well from the pub campaigns against closures that actually people go to the pub simply because they want to keep the business open.
Yeah.
So we now have a situation where government is telling customers to stay away. The business will be sitting there idle and open, and a lot of customers who have those affection for those businesses are going to feel obliged to go in to defend the business. So we are in an extraordinary and unique situation with it. I mean, are you urging government to clarify and to act on this? Because this ambiguity, I think, is going to be quite damaging for the sector, but also for the way public policy unfolds.
I think what we're urging the government to do, in the same way we're urging them to do with the airline industry, is to do whatever it takes to support that industry. I don't know now what the perfect solution it is, what needs to happen in exact detail. But I think, to your point, cafes, pubs, so many of these facilities are the lifeblood of communities. And I think the more we can all think of creative ways to support them, and actually one of the best ideas I heard on radio last night is some of the pubs, you can try and order a pint to your home, as in look, I don't know if that's viable for all pubs. It seems a bit out there, but I think there are, I think about some of my local pubs, and they do amazing pizzas. And if there's a way that I know my community would come together to buy pizzas for home delivery from that pub to keep them going. Look, it's not going to be, they need more support than that. And we've talked about business rates, we've talked about other ways in which we can support.
I think what they need actually is decisiveness, I think, and I think the decision yesterday wasn't decisive. I've got a final question for you, and if the chair allows, Paul, you can come back in afterwards. And this is just another big issue. Before, pretty much all of government's bandwidth is now going to be focused on COVID-19, very understandably. Previous to this, government's bandwidth was pretty much taken up with Brexit and the trade negotiations and the future relationship. That's not being spoken about very much now. Clearly, when you look at the activity within individual member states of the European Union, they are now absolutely overwhelmed with COVID-19. The European Union yesterday has moved to action stations about defending its own borders. It is being now diverted towards COVID-19. We are in the midst of a trade negotiation which has a legal ending of the end of this year. Have you yet, as an organisation, formed an opinion as to whether this is going to be affected by COVID-19? And if we are going to recommend something like extension of those negotiations, now's the time to really do it, because what we can't do is wait for COVID-19 to pass into the autumn when we are weeks away from legally falling out without a deal.
So, COVID-19 will absolutely affect our future relationship with Europe, but now is not the time to be calling for a change in the EU negotiation schedule. Right now, as a country, we need to be focused on how we tackle this crisis, how we all work together across businesses, across employees, across communities, and that's got to be our focus. It may, that's a decision for another day, and I think that's something that we will come on to think and consult with our members when we get closer to that. But right now, we've got to tackle the crisis that's in front of us.
Can I just pick up two final issues before we close the session today? There are some businesses who are going to be in the position where they need to ramp up production and potentially bring in more staff. Thinking particularly around the production of ventilators, and the welcome requests from the Health Secretary yesterday encouraging manufacturers to shift production to producing ventilators, but also in home delivery, where many, many more of us are going to get many more things delivered to our homes because we're not able to get out to the shops. For those sectors that you represent, particularly perhaps you, Ray Newton-Smith, but perhaps Paul Nowak as well, how confident are you that those sectors are going to be able to meet the increased demands, and is there anything government can do to help make that more possible?
So absolutely, these industries are having these conversations, and what we've seen is whether it's between how private healthcare providers are working with the NHS to provide services, or whether it's how the retailers have absolutely come together to say how can we make sure that people who are self-isolating have food delivered to their door, and all of these things, and looking at how at delivery slots. So the businesses are absolutely coming together. I think there's two issues that are quite live already, and some of which have been addressed. So there are simple rules about nighttime deliveries and flexing that to make it easier for that to happen. And there may be more rules that we need to look at, whether how people sign for deliveries. There are very practical things that need to. And the other thing that some of our members have raised is if they, as businesses, who often are, at other times are competing for market share, come together to help provide these services, what they don't want to do is then find out 6 months down the line they're having to go in front of the CMA because they've told they've been colluding in their behaviour. Yeah. So that's a really obvious point where these businesses are coming together to work. We need to make sure that they're then, that they then don't fall under those jurisdictions. So I think those are some of the things we need to think about. And there's other rules where we may need to work with countries across Europe around issues around state aid in terms of supporting different businesses, different sectors, and also where, in certain sectors where people are willing and able and want to work as long as they can to deliver critical services to people. There are issues around the Working Time Directive, which no one would want to touch in normal circumstances. But there's a question as to whether we need some flexibility for some of our healthcare workers, for example, where they are willing and able and want to do that.
Thank you. Paul Nowak.
Just maybe picking up that point last, because it's absolutely essential that if you're taking any decisions in that area, you're doing them alongside and with the staff and their unions rather than imposed unilaterally. And I would just make the point. Yeah, I know. But it's important that employers are talking to each other and potentially talking to government, but it's really important that employees are engaged in that conversation as well, because if we're going to be asking people to work additional shifts or we want delivery drivers to work in a safe manner, what arrangements are going to be put in place, for example, if you have a particular manufacturer that's hit by illness but the neighbouring plant could step in. These are conversations that require the engagement of the staff, and I'd say that that's the bit that's missing from me at the moment, and it's why I talked before about the importance of engaging sectorally, because I think our unions are very much up for a conversation about what is the contribution every single one of us can make to get through this crisis in a way that protects people's health and their livelihoods and their jobs, and nobody's got all the answers. So I think my plea for government would be engage the workforce and unions in that discussion as well.
Thank you. And Ray Newton-Smith, you said earlier on in the session today that for business this isn't just about cash flow, it's a bit more fundamental. And particularly around some of your larger businesses who are in sort of existential crisis, and it may not be the case that loans, or I'm thinking particularly of businesses that have seen huge falls in demand. During the financial crisis, the government stepped in and took a stake in some businesses that were struggling not just with liquidity but also with capital. This might not be the moment to think about those things, but are CBI talking to its members about whether that sort of existential support might be necessary at some stage?
Yes, we absolutely are. I don't think we're mandating the mechanism at this stage, but do we have our members in the airline industry say, this is absolutely critical. What we need to do is protect as many jobs as possible. It does feel like, the survival of the industry in the near term is at stake. And so we need to absolutely have that conversation. And it isn't just about the airline carriers, it's about the airports and all the infrastructure that goes around it. And that's so critical as well for our international trade, right? This is how we get goods and services to people around the world.
And that might include government taking a stake in some of our critical infrastructure.
I think for us, we wouldn't mandate the outcome and the means. I think what we want the government to be doing is thinking about the sectors that are really in the firing line for the issues at the moment, talking to them, finding out what is the best solution, to the problems they are facing, and then also thinking about what are the levers they can pull across the economy, whether that's providing relief from rate, business rate or other tax payments. That's one immediate way you can provide cash flow to sectors across the economy. So we really want the government to be doing whatever it takes. I'm not going to say how they have to do that.
Thank you. And some of the industries that we've spoken about this morning, but that we are also, all of us are particularly concerned around: aviation, rail and bus, leisure, retail and hospitality, potentially construction, as well as all of the freelancers who we've spoken about today, and also some concerns around the insurance sector and their role in all of this. I don't plan to sort of cover everything that was said in a sort of summary, but I think it is worth trying to draw some of this together. I think that the issue that we spent most time on this morning was the issue of statutory sick pay. And Paul, you made the point that around half of households would struggle to pay just for the basics with statutory sick pay. And I think that it was encouraging that all of you spoke about the Temporary Income Protection Fund and looking at the measures taken, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. And Alistair, you spoke about this being a health and an income crisis, and I think Rain made the point as well that we want to protect as many jobs as possible, and we don't want to get to the point where people are unemployed. We need to intervene at an earlier stage than that to stop that happening. And I think there's lots of evidence that shows if workers stay attached to their firms, then it's much easier for the economy to recover afterwards, as well as, of course, supporting people during these really difficult times for them and their families. Martin, I think this is something we're all concerned about people having to make impossible choices about whether they should prioritise their health and prioritise their incomes. And it's a difficult thing to say because, of course, we want everyone to prioritise their health, but thank you for being honest about some of the decisions that your members are going to take, and that's really the role of government, to step in and ensure people are in position to make the right choices for themselves, but also for all of us, because it's in all of our interests if people take the advice that the health professionals and the health secretary are giving to us to self-isolate and to isolate our families where necessary. The issue about small businesses, and again, Martin, particularly from you, but also others, I think are very well taken, and I think we all hope that in the financial statement that's going to be at 7 o'clock this evening, that we see more support for small businesses. The prompt payment point is a point that is always applicable, but it's particularly applicable at the moment. And also about not cancelling things, and this is your point, Alistair, at very short notice. If a freelancer thinks they've got work this week or next week, let's find a way of paying them and not depriving them of that income, even if it means that the service has to be delivered in a different way. Rain's mentioned payment holidays, payment reliefs as well as loan guarantees, but recognising that they're not always appropriate because many businesses worry about whether they can pay back that loan at the end of it. I think the issues of big businesses are different, and Rain, obviously you will represent most of those businesses at the CBI, but this point about prioritising the sectors where there are critical issues, whether that's because of social distancing, about falls in sales, about restrictions on movement, but also not just thinking about where the crisis is today, because next week you're going to add to those numbers of sectors as we have to take further measures to protect public health. So how can we avoid what happened yesterday, which was unfortunate in that people now have got confused advice and mixed signals? How can we make sure that the next announcements about what measures need to be taken, that we think about what support we're going to give to the businesses who were at sort of the sharp end of that? The issues around rents and mortgages and wider issues about banks, it's disappointing, but perhaps not surprising, that although we hear the right words from the leaders of banks, like in the financial crisis, what you get on the ground is not always the same, and that will be the same for small businesses, but also for households as well. And it's really, really important that when banks articulate something nationally, that is filtered down to the relationship managers on the ground, so there's not a bureaucratic and unhelpful response that you've spoken of. And the example of what's happened in France last night about loan guarantees, I think that many of us will hope that the Chancellor will look at extending by an order of magnitude what has already been announced in that area. But more widely, there are many people who are going to be struggling with mortgages, rents, with payments for essential services, and we need to ensure that there is some forbearance and support for those groups of people, and that's the point that Pat made earlier. Just to finish maybe on this point of insurance, I recognise the big concern that many of the businesses faced yesterday. And I think that there's the point that either Paul or maybe it was Rain said that this isn't the time for business as usual in the insurance section. I think that was your point, Paul. And we need to ensure that either the insurance covers the businesses that are going to have to close, but if it isn't, then government support the insurers to support the businesses, and that's the most efficient way to get the support to businesses that are going to have to close for all of our safety. Just to finally end on this point that I think has really reflected all of the contributions today and more widely in this debate, that this is about us coming together, and it is really reassuring and encouraging to see all four of you. You could have switched your name badges around at various points and you would have said the same thing, and that is really good because we're all putting the national interest first here, whether we're representing workers or big businesses or small businesses or the self-employed. And you know, if that's the advice that government is getting, which I no doubt it is, then I'm confident that the Chancellor and the Business Secretary and others have the right information to make the right decisions in all our interests. So thank you very much for today. It's been really helpful. I hope that the Treasury have been watching and updating their 7 o'clock statement based on your advice today. But thank you very much, and I know that you'll do everything you can to support your members in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you. Order, order.
Has ended. The proceeding has ended.